Hi, Bother Brigade. Here's what's bothering me today. Sorry it's been a while, but I feel like we kind of have to talk about what just happened in Europe today. So as basically everyone I know and everywhere on the internet and everyone on the radio is talking about, there was reports of a missile that hit a village on the Polish-Ukrainian border, and it left 2 civilians dead. So we're going to talk about that today, but not in exacting detail because, of course, there's going to be misinformation from both sides. And this isn't going to be some kind of deep dive like, oh, who's lying? Does this have to do with, like, Trump somehow? Like, there's already deep state people saying that it's, like, a front to distract away from that. It's all a bunch of nonsense. So I want to focus on some very key things here. And the main thing is, does this mean we are looking down the barrel of World War III? And the answer is maybe, because it kind of depends on what happens next. So ignoring everything else that people are saying on one side or the other of, oh, is it a Ukrainian S-300 missile, or was it actually a Russian missile that happened? Because it did happen during the time when Russia was launching its largest military missile strike in the entire course of the war so far, and it was around that time, so it's probably them. Again, don't actually quote me on that, but you know, the timelines match up in that regard. Now, the other thing is that all we know is that it landed in Poland, and unfortunately 2 civilians are dead. So the main thing that's going to be on everyone's lips is whether this requires an invoking of Article 5 of the NATO treaty or not. So probably Poland immediately got on the phone, not just with their own military leaders to try and figure out what exactly happened, but also with other NATO members. So what we're looking at right now is a response from the Russians, but unfortunately, the response we've gotten so far is not exactly giving me hope and optimism. Russia denies reports of missiles striking Poland, and Russia calls report of Poland missile strike a provocation. So it's not even like the Russians are issuing a statement saying, oh, hey, yeah, sorry about that. One of our missiles had a malfunction or it veered off course. Sorry about that. We're not even getting that. Instead, we're getting just denialism from Russia. So that's not encouraging. It doesn't necessarily mean World War III, but it's also not encouraging. The other factor at play that we have to consider now is how Poland reacts, because the whole premise of Article 5 of NATO is an attack on one is an attack on all. But that then means they have to prove that it was an outright deliberate attack, which then raises more questions, because now this means we have to deal with potential bloodthirsty war hawks being like, yeah, it was totally an attack, and that's why we gotta go so we can help Ukraine and get involved and fight a war in Russia, because that always ends well historically, am I right? And then it also unfortunately means, in that, you know, extreme case of war coming to blows between Russia and the West, nukes more than likely fly in that scenario, which again, no one actually really wants. Russia doesn't want to rule over a nuclear wasteland. They want to rule over an area where they can still pretend to be little emperors and whatnot. So then this brings us to the other possibility of how Poland and the rest of NATO decide to react to this, which again brings us back to the point of, was this an intentional attack? And if they decide, oh, you know what, we're doing all right so far by just providing a lot of military aid to Ukrainian forces. They seem to be holding their own against the Russians. So, you know what, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We don't need to escalate unnecessarily. The current thing that we are doing is working pretty well. And then it's declared, yeah, you know what, whatever Russia says, whether they admit to fault or not, they may just say that the missile attack, while unfortunate, does not constitute an outright attack, and therefore Article 5 cannot and should not be invoked. That is a possibility. Now, that will, of course, upset some people, saying, how can we just let innocent civilians die? Russia needs to pay. But then those people still don't recognize that then they are asking for a nuclear armed conflict that more than likely ends civilization in the world as we know it. So not exactly a great thing to cheer for. But again, this brings us to the overarching question of, does this mean World War III? The answer is unfortunately maybe. It's kind of out of all of our hands right now, which is really concerning, but that's the grim situation we are in. It now depends on the response, or further, like, appropriate response by Russian military officials, which, as we've already seen previously in the video, we're not exactly going to count on that. So it's really up to how Poland and NATO decide to react to this, which unfortunately means that this is going to come down to about having some kind of sensible stance on this, or being absolutely bloodthirsty and desiring potentially nuclear armed conflict. And unfortunately, it now rests in the hands of NATO, which is already holding a great many of the cards in any kind of fight that happens anywhere on the planet. And unfortunately, the potential result of this, not that it's likely or that it's going to happen, but that a very real possible outcome is nuclear warfare, and thus the destruction of all of society, is deeply troubling. And anyone wanting that should not be trusted and should not be near any lever of power. And the fact that that's not the case, and we have to have this discussion while there is mounds and mounds of information and blame going back and forth, all while the world is now far closer to midnight, is definitely what's bothering me today.